Hello everyone, thank you for joining us. I know it's super early. You had a lot of other options. This is the panel entitled Whiteness is Property, Conceptual Origins and Disruptions. So the order that we're going in is first, like based on what you see here, and I'm gonna read out all of their bios first, and then we're gonna go in order. And then afterwards you'll have time to ask any questions, so make sure you're writing out any questions that you have during the conversation. Okay. Okay. So Don Anque, sorry if I butchered names, is the author of several academic publications ranging from legal pedagogy to environmental policy. His journalism and scholarship work has been featured with various universities around the country, including Temple University, the University of California, Arizona State University, and Harvard Journal of Hispanic Policy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Anque is also the creator of a documentary entitled The Affected Others, an examination of race, class, and gender at UC Riverside. His research interests include commercial law, ethics, business development, and constitutional law. Anque received his JD from Syracuse University and his BA in English from UCR. While at Syracuse, he served as a student attorney and earned a Siegel AmeriCorps Education Award for his work on criminal defense. Anque also earned a certificate in national security and counterterrorism at Syracuse and was a technology director for the Impunity Watch Law Journal. For UCR, Anque was awarded a full ride grant from the California Department of Veterans Affairs and was the primary investor for the ASUCR biodiesel program. In 2007, he gave the graduate address for the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences graduation ceremony at UCR. Next, we'll have Khaled Beydoun. He is an assistant professor at the Berry School of Law. Before joining the Berry Law faculty, he served as a Critical Race Studies Fellow at the UCLA School of Law. His scholarship, focusing on the racialization of Arab and Muslim Americans, has been featured in the Howard Law Journal, the Michigan Journal of Race and Law, and the NYU Annual Survey of American Law. In addition to his legal scholarship, Professor Beydoun is a regular contributor to Al Jazeera English. Before entering academia, Professor Beydoun served as an appellate public defender in the state of Michigan, a staff attorney with the ACLU of Michigan, and an international rule of law analyst in the Middle East and Northern Africa. He is a graduate of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law, the University of Michigan, and is a native of Detroit. Next, we have Natsu Saito. She is a professor of law at Georgia State University in Atlanta, where she has taught public international law, international human rights, race in the law, international law and indigenous peoples, immigration, and related courses since 1994. Professor Saito's scholarship focuses on the legal history of race in the United States, the plenary power doctrine as applied to American Indians, immigrants, and external U.S. colonies, and the human rights implications of U.S. governmental policies, particularly with regard to the suppression of political dissent. In addition to some 24 law review articles, Professor Saito is the author of 2 books, Beating the Enemy, American Exceptionalism in International Law, and From Chinese Exclusion to Guantanamo Bay, Plenary Power and the Prerogative State. And a 3rd book, Settler Colonialism and Race in America, is under construct with NYU Press. Her forthcoming work includes essays in UCLA's Asian Pacific American Law Journal and Chicana Latina Law Review. As a member of the Georgia Bar, Professor Saito has served on its committee on the involvement of women and minorities in the profession and the Georgia Supreme Court's Commission on Racial and Ethnic Bias in the Courts. A co-founder of Georgia chapter of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, she helped form Georgia State's Asian American Law Students Association and advises the Hispanic Student Bar Association. Before becoming an attorney, Professor Saito was a community organizer and teacher, and she remains active in supporting indigenous rights, academic freedom, political prisoners, and homeless persons. She is a co-director with Kathleen Cleaver of the Human Rights Research Fund, a member of the Board of Governors of the Society of American Law Teachers, and chair of SALT's Academic Freedom Committee. Okay, and last but not least, we have Howard Winant, is a professor of sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara, where he is also affiliated with the Black Studies, Chicano Studies, and Asian American Studies Department. He received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 1980. Winant has worked and taught in Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Professor Winant is the founding director of the University of California Center for New Racial Studies, a multi-campus research program initiative. He is the author of Racial Formation in the United States, co-authored Michael Omni, The New Politics of Race, Globalism, Difference, Justice, The World is a Ghetto, Race and Democracy Since World War II, Racial Conditions, Politics Theory, Comparisons, and Stalemate, Political Economic Origins of Supply Side Policy. And without further ado, we have Don Anque.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the planning committee of the Critical Race Studies Symposium for putting on this event. Everything's been running smoothly. It's absolutely fantastic. Had a great time yesterday. And I'd also like to thank Professors Cortijo-Doval and Elin Cortijo-Doval for their contributions in help writing this paper. I would also like to thank Professor Cheryl Harris for writing Whiteness is Property. That's why we're all here. And, one more thing. Currently, I am employed by the Democratic Party, but the views expressed in this presentation are not the views of the Democratic Party and not the views of the Democratic Party. And also, they are not the views of the candidates that I have campaigned for also. So that being said, this is There and Back Again, Native American Tribal Disenrollment and Heritage. Now, what does that look like? So this is a photograph of the Prickett family. They are former members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde in Oregon. They received their disenrollment papers, and they are no longer tribal members. It's been very tumultuous for the family, tumultuous time. The papers are right here. So she's holding her previous tribal membership card. It's null and void, and even though they claim that the documentation that Mia Prickett and the rest of her family had given to the selection and tribal council, they still didn't believe her. These photographs date a huge amount of years, and still they rejected it. And so the reasoning behind that were for these two here. There's many more requirements, but these were the largest of the spaces. The applicant must have a parent who was enrolled at the Grand Ronde at the time of her birth, and the applicant must have an ancestor of direct lineal descent from the 1984 restoration roll to determine the possession of Grand Ronde tribal blood. Now, according to Mia, she felt culturally homeless after losing basically her entire existential identity, and she also, the rest of her family is in the same boat. Now, legally, because her ability to say that she's Native American, like when you apply for college, it's like, what race are you? Like, that's totally not available for her. The rest of, like, if she decides to have children, that's not going to happen anymore either. So what does it mean to be Native American? Under the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, the term Indian, as used in the Act, shall include all persons of Indian descent who are members of any recognized Indian tribe now under federal jurisdiction, and all persons who are descendants of such members who were, on June 1st, 1934, residing within the present boundaries of any Indian reservation, and shall further include all persons of one half or more Indian blood. Now, this act, the IRA was written in response to the Dawes Act, which is a terrible allotment act. There were a huge amount of law review papers on this. And so essentially, the Indian New Deal, or the IRA Act, had given a lot of sovereignty powers back, and it also gave the ability for Native American tribes to determine who is, in fact, Native American. So based on that, the U.S. is huge. I'm pretty much sure all of you are experts in like cultural sensitivity, and not all Native Americans belong to one homogenous group. They have Native American tribes have diverse interests, diverse backgrounds, diverse beliefs, governing structures, so etc. Looking at the membership requirements, as noted previously, not all Native American tribes share the same governing structures, and enrollment requirements. The Navajo Nation, to be a member, you must be at least a quarter. Cherokee Nation requires that your citizenship does not require a specific blood quantum. It does require that you have at least one direct Cherokee ancestor listed on the Dawes Final Rolls. That was the act that I was talking about. A federal census of those living in the Cherokee Nation that was used to allot Cherokee land to individual citizens in preparation for Oklahoma statehood. And the enrollment paragraphs go on, but for adoption cases, citizenship must be proven through the biological parent to the enrolled ancestor, meaning if two Cherokee folks decide to adopt a child, that person is not a Cherokee member. So many Native American tribes have blood quantum requirements. Others have performance requirements and continued contact with the land and residency requirements. So it's a full spectrum. So although the blood quantum thing is huge, not all Native American tribes use blood quantum. So after the Prickett family was kicked out, I posed a very large question on how would you feel if you were kicked out of your ethnic group, the ability to be kicked out of your own ethnic group. There's a huge amount of case law going back and forth, roller coaster ride, if you will, of the federal government writing laws against Native American sovereignty, the Supreme Court supporting that. This is probably like 2 semesters worth of case law that we could go over, but I'm pretty sure all of you are familiar with the history of the U.S. against Native Americans. So after the Prickett family was disenrolled, they were exiled from tribal lands. They lost stipend, educational benefits such as scholarship money, child care benefits, health care benefits. Like I mentioned before, hereditary erasure. Her children, Mia Prickett, if she decides to have children, are no longer Native American, and they're pretty much in a race and ethnicity legal limbo. Now, some Native American tribal members who were exiled have declared that they will not stop being Native American. They will still teach their children the tribal language as much as possible. And in many cases, there is a huge amount of depression associated, but hopefully these folks bounce back. Oh, this is another photo of also funny story about this, like what does it mean to be Native American? Not all Native Americans look like stereotypical Native American. I'm pretty sure like I said before, like the diverse interests, diverse backgrounds, the Prickett family is still like tied down to the roots. And so the ability for a tribe to determine whether or not you're a member, like I mentioned before about the case law as a roller coaster, is something that pretty much the most, if not all, Native American tribes need to maintain the ability to regroup, such as that has been pretty much been culturally and legally destroyed in many cases, and especially during the Trail of Tears. And coming from Arkansas and seeing the country, the part of the country that was lost, it's extremely depressing. So like, there's been a lot of accusations of the reason why folks are getting kicked out is because of the casino stipend being like one of them. The less amount of people in a group with a fund like that, the more amount of people, the more amount of money the small group could receive. But on that basis alone, me and the other authors are not taking a stance on that because we are not stakeholders. We're just here to talk about possibilities. And getting back to the possibilities of many Native American tribes, how do you say, like the public discovery, or like New York Times going in and asking a selection committee, hey, give us the paperwork that you said that was wrong and disenrolled like 2,000 people. The tribal council and the selection committee has said, no, we are a sovereign nation and you're not going to have it. Case law supports this. You can come back to us, we're going to give you the same answer. And pretty much this has been going on consistently. But I think that the amount of pushback from both the press, other law groups, and the folks that were kicked out have begun a larger movement of what happens to the people that are in absolute diaspora at this point. So in conclusion, we hope that that the folks that were kicked out find peace, but also at the same time it's difficult for them to do that because they were kicked out, and we're not taking a stance on who's right or wrong here because sovereignty is a very important issue to maintain, especially because the case law supports it, and on a philosophical level, like the ability for a group to do that to another set of people, it's pretty, quite frankly, intense. So on that note, thank you guys for coming, and we appreciate the critical race studies group and former fellow. So thank you so much.
Good morning. It's always surreal returning to this room. My first year criminal law class was in here, so whenever I sit down, I'm thinking about the
Full circle.
Yeah, so it's full circle. You know, I taught here for a couple of years. It's still strange to come to these spaces. So my conversation is going to focus on my forthcoming paper, Antebellum Islam, which focuses on the initial Muslim communities here in the States who were enslaved Africans. They're a highly neglected, highly overlooked Muslim population, both in legal literature at large, but also specifically within the rising literature focusing on Muslim Americans post 9/11 and also today. Even though I'm going to focus specifically on my paper, I'm going to also foreshadow some of my future research, which is linked to the racialization of both Arab and Muslim Americans, and hopefully try to link this piece, which is very much a legal history piece, with what's going on today in the modern day. Today is Eid al-Adha, the second of the two most significant Muslim holidays. In several hours from now, more than 8 million Muslim families will convene with Muslim Americans will convene with their families, join in collective prayer at their mosques, and break bread together in commemoration of the greater Eid. The United States is home to the most racially diverse Muslim community in the world. African Americans comprise the biggest plurality, followed by South Asian and Arab Americans, and a rapidly growing community of Caucasian and Latino Muslims. This demographical reality, however, is eclipsed by the Orientalist equation tying Islam inextricably with Arab identity, which systematically excludes the vast community of Muslim Americans who fit outside the prevailing racial caricature. Although observed on North American continent for greater than 3 centuries, today's Eid is popularly characterized as a foreign tradition celebrated by foreign and fringe people. representing Islam's broader positionality within the American political imagination. However, Islam is anything but new. Its practice on its soil predates the birth of the United States as an independent nation state and was observed 200 years before immigrant waves from the Arab world first set their sights on America. Enslaved Muslims observed Eid al-Adha as part of the rich mosaic of Muslim spiritual traditions as early as the 17th century. Social scientists estimate that 15 to 30% of the Africans enslaved in the antebellum South practiced Islam, and in the face of de jure dehumanization and strictly enforced slave codes, strove to adhere to the Islamic way of life while bonded to slavery. Research indicates that the Muslim population could have been as high as 1.2 million, comprising more than 1/8 of the size of Muslim America today. Therefore, although branded an immigrant and Arab faith, these statistical and corporeal bodies of evidence testify that Islam's roots in America are deeply entrenched, indigenous, and black. In the interest of time, my presentation will focus on the focal argument of my forthcoming piece, Antebellum Islam. More specifically, I will introduce and briefly explain the formative legal processes that define Muslim and black identities in narrow and irreconcilable terms. The clashing racialization of Muslim and black identity first brought forth the virtual erasure of enslaved Muslims from legal scholarship. Legal scholars that examine American slave history excluded Islam from their definitions of slave and African religion, although Islam was practiced in Africa since the 9th century. Second, I will briefly examine how the narrow racial formation of black and Muslim identities continues to frustrate seeing both in integrated, harmonious terms. Although African American Muslims comprise the greatest plurality of the Muslim American population today, when the two identities are conjoined, black Muslims specifically conjures up imagery of the Nation of Islam and followers of the NOI, instead of the established and sizable population of quote-unquote Orthodox Muslims. Two factors brought about this segregation. First, the law remade Africans into black slaves, and state slave codes criminalized their religious activity and stripped slaves of their religious identities. As illustrated in Whiteness' property, blackness was shaped in the mirror opposite of whiteness and reduced to a legal interest held by those who claimed the latter. Second, the state adopted a political conception of Muslim identity that converted it from a religious into a racial identity in the specific profile of Arabs, and less so Turks, a non-white class that racially restrictive naturalization laws barred from claiming citizenship. While interlocked between two distinct racial classifications, Islam not only remained central in the lives of enslaved Muslims, but also emerged into a liberation theology that perpetually reaffirmed the dignity, humanity, and transnational Muslim citizenship in the face of slavery and slave codes. Okay, moving on to the first prong, where I discussed the formation of blackness and how that impacted enslaved Muslims specifically. In Whiteness' property, Cheryl Harris observed that the black color of the skin raised the presumption of slavery. The conflation of blackness inscribed the status of slaves on Africans, and in turn, eliminated the diverse cultural, tribal, and geographic origins of enslaved Africans. Before arriving in America, enslaved Muslims identified along lines of religion and also tribal affiliation. They were Mande, Fulani, Serer, Tukalor, and Hausa, among an array of other African tribes. However, that cultural heterogeneity was flattened by the legal formation of black as a racial category and its legal equation with slavery. Furthermore, because slaves were a quote, a beastly and godless people, unquote, religion, as the most sacred and central property interest, was stripped from them. Thus, black was converted into chattel, and in turn, one-dimensional beings divorced entirely from religious or spiritual identity. Some theme music. Muslim identity, on the other hand, was narrowly tailored in the racial image of Arabs. As discussed in my article, Between Muslim and White, Orientalist polemics and perspectives influenced early American views of Islam and Muslims, who until the mid-20th century were called Mohammedans by media outlets, politicians, and presidents, and ultimately the courts. Arab was viewed as invariably the same as Muslim during the antebellum era, as illuminated by 10 of the 53 naturalization cases. And these naturalization cases were closely examined by Ian Haney-Lopez in his book, White by Law. So of the 53 total cases, 10 involved an immigrant petitioner from the Arab world. The prevailing judicial presumption during the naturalization era, which lasted until 1952, was that one thing to quickly note for those unfamiliar with this area of the law is that in order for individuals to become naturalized citizens, you had to be considered or ruled white by a civil court. So whiteness was effectively a prerequisite for citizenship up until 1952. The prevailing judicial presumption that during the naturalization era, which lasted until 1952, was that any and all immigrants from the Muslim world were Muslim, despite the fact that 90% of immigrants that came to the U.S. during the racially restrictive era were Christian and originated from the Levant. The Levant obviously is modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Jordan, which houses the most concentrated Muslim communities and Christian communities in the entire Arab world. The 10 cases, which I call the Arab naturalization cases, not only institutionalize an image and understanding of Muslims as irreducibly foreign and inassimilable, but disoriented Muslim identity as narrowly Arab and non-black. The Naturalization Act explicitly restricted non-whites as prospective American citizens, and prevailing understandings of Muslims as exclusively Arabs entrenched the idea that blacks could not be Muslim. Arab was conflated with Muslim, and this legal conversion of religion into a narrow racial caricature eliminated the possibility of seeing black Muslims as Muslims. So before closing, I would like to briefly discuss how Islam, and more precisely Islamic law, inspired enslaved Muslims to rebel. And this kind of illuminates how the clash between the imposed identity of blackness and the rejection of their Muslim identities essentially positioned enslaved Africans between slave code, but also divine code, Islamic law, which eventually inspired a kind of rebellion to be seen among slaves, which scholars, including Sylvia Andrew and Alan Austin, who studied this really closely, say was more representative and more disproportionate amongst Muslim slaves. So Islam's collision with American race-based slavery ignited the spirit of resistance and rebellion that mobilized Muslim slaves to question and confront mechanisms that enforce their subjugation. Islamic law ordains Muslims to rebel against actors that oppress one's faith to freely exercise their faith. Such obstructionist forces are referred to as fitna. Sherman Jackson defines fitna within the context of American slavery as, quote, emphatic opposition to white supremacy as a system of domination whose daily assaults on black consciousness bludgeon the human spirit and simultaneously undermine and abuse the fact of black humanity. The process of short-circuiting blacks' efforts to realize their humanity as a matter of divine fiat as opposed to some honorary recognition granted on the satisfaction of self-serving criteria imposed by the dominant culture, I identify with the Quranic term fitna, which the Quran characterizes as being worse than murder. Slavery and the assault of the bodies and minds of slaves presented an extreme form of fitna, which ordained Muslim slaves to take action against their slaveholders and liberate themselves from a condition that suppressed their ability to lead a Muslim life. This tradition of resistance in the face of state laws and policies that criminalize religious activity and specific religious identities is manifested by Muslim Americans today, who not only find sanctuary through faith, but sources for strategies to combat NSA surveillance, local police monitoring, and simplistic conflations with the boogeyman du jour, ISIS. Finally, before I close, I'd like to highlight how the formative construction of black and Muslim are deployed to undermine seeing both as coexistent in the modern day. Indeed, this antebellum binary continues to marginalize African American Muslims from academic and political projects addressing Muslim American sidelining, suffering, and civil rights. I'll address two examples. There's three, but I'll focus on two, and maybe we can delve into the third one more closely during the Q&A. First, the programming of Muslim American organizations have largely prioritized issues in programming that caters to the specific interests of Arab and South Asian American Muslims. One cannot overlook how anti-black racism within majority Arab and South Asian Muslim American communities enhances the programmatic and constituent prioritization, and relatedly, fuels the unseeing of African American Muslims as illegitimate Muslims. Second, despite African American Muslims currently ranking as the population's biggest plurality, legal scholarship focusing on Muslim Americans has, after 9/11 and still today, is almost entirely devoid of any mention of African American Muslims. This body of scholarship is almost exclusively concerned with Arab Americans, which highlights how the conflation of Arab with Muslim identity is even subscribed to among progressive commentators. With that, I'd like to close, and there's more I'd like to discuss with the modern day deployment of this, quote-unquote antebellum binary that I discussed, and how it informs, both progressive and obviously conservative imaginations of Muslim identity. Thank you.
Here's something formal here for but thank you. Those are great presentations. It is, of course, an honor to be here, and I would like to add my thanks, as everyone has done, to the organizers, to the people who did the really hard work. We just get to do the fun part. And of course, for the opportunity to explore this notion of whiteness as property in more depth. couple of preliminary things I'd like to say. One is, as several speakers have pointed out, we are on Indian land, and I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the Tongva and Chumash people whose land I believe this is. One of the things that is very telling is how difficult it is to figure out whose land we're on at any given moment. That says a lot about the disappearance, the forced disappearance of Indigenous peoples in a broad sense. And I want to acknowledge the struggles for ethnic studies that have taken place, particularly with this university, that laid the groundwork for critical race theory. I can't come here without thinking about the murders of Bungie Carter and John Huggins, while they just, a few buildings over when they were in the course of trying to establish Black Studies programs. And Khaled's presentation just made me also need to just say that I need to say that it's hard for me to be here today without thinking of Imam Jamil Al-Amin, who I think exemplifies the fear that the state sees in the coming together of African American and Muslim, the intersectionality there. There's a good reason why those folks are at the top of the target list, and it happens in addition to being Eid to be Jamil's birthday today. Anyway, I thought a lot over the past couple of years about the hope and energy that we had during the era when these programs were getting established, during the 60s and early 70s. There was so much hope and energy. And what has happened to that hope and energy, and what we can do to sort of revitalize some of that within the youth. And it seems pretty clear that our pursuit of the equal protection equal rights paradigm has really kind of led us into this legal cul-de-sac. And in thinking about that, it raises for me the question of what always seems to me to be a disconnect between our struggles for civil rights, equal protection, equal access, with respect to people of color in this country, and the struggles that relate to Indigenous peoples in this country. It seems like there's a membrane almost separating those, and we can talk about one, or we can talk about the other, but we don't have a good way of bringing them together. And for me, when I had to go back and look at Whiteness as property again, really sort of carefully, it really struck me that Cheryl has given us a tremendous gift in finding a way to bring these together. And that's what I really want to talk about. And I'm in a certain way exploring some of these ideas, and I would love some feedback from you all on them. As Elin's presentation pointed out, one of the things between these struggles with respect to Indigenous peoples, especially in the U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand, is that we have the same colonizer, right? We're talking about settler colonial states that were established primarily by Anglo-American colonists. And what's different about these kinds of colonial relations is that these colonists didn't come to extract value, profit from the land and labor and natural resources of the colony and take it home to their mother country. They came to stay. And that, I think, defines what's so significant about our relations in this country today. They came with what Lorenzo Veracini talks about as a presumption of sovereign entitlement. They came to set up their own society, their own state. And that, of course, meant, first of all, they had to get the territorial base, and to get the territorial base, they have to eliminate Indigenous peoples in one form or another. And a lot of this, of course, was very direct physical elimination and forced relocation, but it was also the erasure and control, commodification, et cetera, of Indigenous cultures and identities, as Don's presentation has pointed out so clearly. Then, once they've got the territorial base established, they have to make it productive and profitable. And that's where we get into the importation, the forced importation of enslaved labor, the recruitment of other forms of labor. And we end up with a society in which there is this whole group of people that are at least initially recruited and or forced to come here for labor in some form or another, but who are not intended to become part of the settler class. The sovereign prerogative of the settlers, which is very much defined in terms of their construction of whiteness and their white identity, which again goes to, that prerequisite cases that you're talking about, right? Who is white, and how are we going to narrowly define white to reflect, being entitled to settler prerogatives. But if we look at it in this way, those of us who are not indigenous to this continent, but were not intended to become part of the settler class either, have a very sort of distinct relationship. And to me, this is a sort of an under-theorized and understood, thought about, fleshed out aspect of settler colonial theory, which has to this point mostly focused on settler-indigenous relations, which it should. I mean, that's primary, right? You can't talk about anything else unless you start from that perspective. But I also think that it's really important for us to think about this third leg of the triangle, side of the triangle, whatever, because that's what explains the racialized hierarchy that we are contesting in our efforts to bring about racial justice through equal protection theory, et cetera. But if this is not simply sort of a clear, two-dimensional hierarchy, that adds, a kind of complexity that I think might explain why our equal protection work just keeps ending us up in that cul-de-sac. I also think that, as Mari Matsuda has talked about with respect to Asian Americans, those of us who are non-indigenous, non-settlers, there's all kinds of really cumbersome terms for this in the literature, like exogenous others and, whatnot. But we are placed in the middle, in a sense. We are the ones who are benefiting in certain respects, and certainly are intended to believe that we are benefiting from the exploitation and appropriation of indigenous lands, and yet we serve as a buffer, we serve as a legitimation force for the colonial structures. And so as I think about, how we get past this and what we do with this different sort of lens, and really how the bottom line in a lot of ways is how those of us who are not indigenous and not intended to, be part of the settler class, get past that notion of, well, we really aren't indigenous to this place, and so therefore our struggle should be about gaining more of the benefits of colonial appropriation. Like, how do we get past that, and how do we get past that in a way that allows people to see it as being in their interest, not just, oh, the poor Indians were massacred, right? And I really think that whiteness as property is critical to that step. So I want to talk a little bit about why I come to believe that. Cheryl's really clear that, but she points out sort of the bottom line for me is that property and rights associated with property, or rights in, or the property rights that sort of adhere to what we think of as intangible rights, in their current form can't exist without whiteness. And we know that whiteness doesn't exist without otherness. And therefore, claiming a right to what is in effect a type of whiteness is going to necessarily be futile. And I think she sort of spells out why that is for us. And it goes to what she terms the conceptual nucleus of the right to exclude. And so, she's given us a great gift, I think, in terms of talking about whiteness as being a core element of the construction of property. So it's not just about rights to property or the commodification of whiteness, but the actual construction of property, tangible and intangible. The easiest example, I think, for us to see is, of course, the transformation of human beings into chattel, into enslaved, not even enslaved persons, right, into slaves. And we get the critical element of whiteness there. We can see it because if there is a legal, okay, thank you. I will move on, assume that that's clear. But it's also clear, and she points out pretty well how that was done with how the same transformation of something that's not necessarily seen as property was done with respect to the land. And, that's the Johnson versus McIntosh story, right? The taking of something and constructing a very right notion of what is property, right? Not only whose property it can be, but how it can be defined as property. And several of our speakers, including Elin, have talked about, how this wasn't necessarily individually alienable property. There's all kinds of different ways of understanding one's relationship to the land and one's responsibilities to the land. But we know that those were very, that the construction of this land as alienable, excludable property cannot be separated from racialization. It's also, I think, whiteness is intrinsic to the definition not only ownership of property, construction of property, but also the definition of ownership. So the idea that owning property means a right to alienate, a right to exclude, again, is not necessarily, that's not obvious, right? That's a very colonial, very Western type of construction. So my bottom line here, I think, is that if we can understand the ways in which property, the things that we are trying to gain equal access to, are inherently constructed and administered in terms of whiteness, we can start to see that claiming a piece of that whiteness is not a viable solution. And I also think that's true in terms of rights and our property interest in rights as well. It also means that we run a danger in engaging in these struggles for equal access to these rights because by our very act of claiming an equal piece of this, we are reinforcing and legitimating that structure and those rights. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't struggle for equal protection, or we don't, we have to do those things to survive. But it means that we do them with a kind of consciousness, I think, that gets us beyond that doesn't see that as the end goal. Because if our end goal is simply to be colonizers too, I don't want to go there. And I don't think it will be liberatory for any of us. So that's, I think, to me, what allows us to get, break through that membrane for all of us who are not Indigenous to see that if we don't challenge the very ways in which property and property rights are contingent upon whiteness, we will never be liberated either. And this also means that we have to get beyond the sort of framework of constitutional rights, equal protection, due process, etc., if we're really going to try to find liberatory solutions. And to me, understanding that this is really truly still a colonial system, and these are colonial relationships of racial hierarchy that we're talking about, means that we need to look to what's involved in decolonization. And that's, not an easy question, obviously. There's no simple answers. But it means that we take, among at least, as a starting point, that we take the right to self-determination seriously. And we recognize that that's an organic and ongoing process. It's not like there's some answer and we don't impose upon people. If you were to exercise your right to self-determination, here's what it would look like, right? Because that would be inherently, sort of contradictory. And we think about ways in which these rights can be exercised at, I think, at even a very local level. Because I think any struggle can be liberatory and can be an exercise in the right to self-determination. It doesn't only have to be the end point of, we want our own separate country, et cetera. And, when I've talked about this perspective with young folks who seem really discouraged with what their options are and who look at our struggles as having sort of failed for good reason, I see a light come back in their eyes. And that, to me, says that there's something here that is worth pursuing. Thank you.
Greetings, people.
Right.
This is such an intimate setting. It's really a kind of a gift, I think, in terms of our ability to talk over things, and really appreciate the previous panels also, all of this would enlighten me. I'm grateful to be here. This is, I think, the third symposium I've been involved in, and it's always a tremendous learning experience. I'm also very pleased that the center I direct, the UC Center for New Racial Studies, has been able to sponsor, to be an institutional sponsor of the symposium. So we're definitely going to shift the balance a little bit, or shift the focus a little bit, to talk about whiteness. First of all blessings on Cheryl Harris for the incredible article, which is really more like a book, I think, than an article in some ways. It's a whole monograph or something like that, a legal monograph. Whiteness of Property is a fundamental text in critical race theory, a crucial contribution to the analysis of race and racism, or something that remains as indispensable today as it was 20 years ago, or a little bit. So what I want to ask is the question I want to ask is, how should whiteness be approached politically? And that's not something that Cheryl deals with directly in this article. I view my talk today as an uncertain and risk-taking venture, an invitation to discussion and debate. And I've recurred, in preparing this talk, I've recurred to Du Bois, of course, as one has to do, and particularly to the souls of white folk. Just a quote from Du Bois. He says in a rage, actually, I attribute, he says, "Whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen." That's a statement of rage, but I think it's also a very sarcastic statement, not something he actually believes, not something anyone should really believe, although many people do believe that. So, although whites are generally committed, particularly structurally committed, if we can use such a language, but also culturally, personally, experientially committed to defending their property, defending their whiteness, there's also a substantial legacy of white anti-racism. Where does it come from? How can it be developed? People of color need white allies. I mean, can we seriously envision undermining, dismantling white supremacy without the participation of whites themselves. Given the immense weight, the immense legacy traced by Cheryl and many others too, influenced by Cheryl, of whiteness as property, what should be demanded of whites? There have been many approaches to this. I'm not the first to ever ask this question, obviously enough. I would argue, and again, I hope we can debate these things, that whiteness cannot be abolished. Short of revolutionary and fairly apocalyptic upheaval that has little to recommend it. In the long run, it's possible that whiteness will be abolished in a sort of millennial or epochal sense, simply by its untenable qualities, the untenable quality of that's indicated by Du Bois's, again, enraged and sarcastic comment, the ownership of the earth forever and ever, and then. But short of the long run, I'm not talking about the long run, I'm talking about our political conditions, our political situation. I won't enter into the whole history, but I basically endorse Gerald Horne's argument that the American Revolution of 1776 was in fact a counter-revolution of whiteness, a counter-revolution of slavery, as he calls it. From the very beginning, the U.S. has been based in, the existence, the identity of the U.S. has been based in, has been an imperial project. Settler rule, racial rule, white rule. Yet, all the way back as well, to the beginning and before the beginning, there have been times that whites and blacks and whites and Latinos and whites and Native Americans, whites and Asian Americans, united across the colonies, across the newly established and later nation of the United States, to challenge oppression. I mean, we know this was Bacon's Rebellion, abolitionism itself, the Civil War itself, Reconstruction era, republicanism, Freedom Summer, down to our own time, the solidarity movements that we are part of today. Beyond that, there are well-established, game-shifting, I would argue, transitions that are taking place. The demographic shift that's taking place to a majority-minority society. A society in which, by the way, whites will still be the main minority, largest minority, and will still be possessed of the legacy of whiteness as property. There are many other transitions too. The much more acknowledged, much more prevalent mixed race transition that's going on. Mixed race relationships, families, identities. There's a lot more consciously intersectional politics and intersectional experience. We've been talking about that some in the big sessions. Queers of color organizing, Russell Robinson brought out. There's a great deal of intersectionality with Earth First, anti-racism, intersectionality, that is to say, white participation and non-white, people of color participation in a whole range of movements. We can talk about the struggles within feminism, within second and third wave feminism, to make I won't say integrate, but synthesize. That's what intersectionality is about. White, non-white, white and people of color, insurgency. Of course, nothing I'm saying is meant to deny the intransigence, the embeddedness of racist structures and practices in white America. But racism hurts whites, as well as conferring privilege upon them. Consider the Civil War itself. Something like 500,000 whites were killed in the Civil War. I'm drawing this from John Bracey's work. Other people made this comment too. If there had been an effective challenge to racial slavery, would that not have been tremendously in the interest of many, many whites? Not all whites. Consider the current political situation in this country, the current Republican war on the ACA, Obamacare. I mean, again, I'm not a total partisan of Obamacare. It's going to consider a major subsidy to the Wall Street and big insurance and so on. But millions of poor whites are being excluded from health care by that Republican challenge. It's not just an attack on Obama, an attack on, the 47% is, I guess the 53%. So I suggest that it's not the repudiation or abolition of whiteness, but it's reinvention that provides the key to what we might call in a strictly secular sense, redemption, the redemption of whites. Freedom Summer provides a very good example of this. There in 1964 in Mississippi, innocent and naive in many ways, not everybody, but open-hearted and idealistic white youth made commitments and sacrifices to support blacks. Local people, quote unquote, that's Dittmer's phrase, and other people's phrase too, risked their lives in order to be helped, quote unquote, helped by the white volunteers of Freedom Summer. There's a big trade-off there. Whites in small ways, often without recognition of the fact, again, sought a certain redemption, certain expiation, certain effort to dislodge the curse of whiteness. Blacks sought to be shielded from white violence by the presence, by the alliance that they were making with these same youth. Though far from complete, that alliance made 1960s radicalism possible. Civil rights, the New Left, second-wave feminism, anti-imperialism, even gay liberation, as it was called then, and environmentalism, as it was called then, arose from this. Even the failures of this alliance, which were massive, like the betrayal of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 Atlantic City Convention, made certain political events impossible. Black power comes out of that. The resurgence of Marxism in the United States, the rise of anti-imperialism, mass anti-war activism, lots of autonomous movements. Ultimately, CRT, critical race theory itself, comes out of that. Now, I can personally testify, I guess, to the right, to the strength and problems of white anti-racism. I think most white anti-racists echo my views. I took part in that 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer reunion that happened in Jackson, Mississippi this last June. It was a very inspiring event. It not only commemorated the past, but it looked determinedly towards the future. Massive work was done on considering black-brown relationships, alliances, immigration questions. A large contingent of gray-haired, white veterans, I mean obviously gray-haired black veterans and Latinos and Asian veterans too, of Freedom Summer connected with many local people today. Young activists of color, of all colors, whites as well as non-whites, gathered around. So, just to finish, the racial subjectivity, the self-awareness that were developed by people of color movements also affected whites. Many were threatened. Many are threatened. But some were liberated, or at least partially, moved towards anti-racism from the stranglehold of whiteness as property. While whiteness remains as property, while white supremacy retains much of its strength in the souls of white folk, and in state and civil society that whites basically still control, there is also substantial white anti-racism. This needs to be developed and nurtured. Thank you.
All right, so now it's time for questions. We really appreciate it, as many other panelists mentioned. A lot of the work is a work in progress, so any comments, any questions?
Convince everybody.
I'm especially interested in the legal scholars' response to this. Of course, we always welcome hearing from Howie. I understand that in the law, property means something a little different than it does in everyday life, and that property has rights in a way that lay people don't quite see. So when you say that whiteness is property, it has a kind of protected status in the law that other things don't. And remember, Cheryl says that it's an expectation. It's not only something that is protected now, but it's a promise that expectations will be fulfilled. And I wonder if you could, even though you're dealing with different situations, it does seem to me that the whole issue of enrollment, disenrollment is not something that emanates from the needs of Indigenous people. It starts with the administrative category of whiteness as property, and similarly the erasure of Muslim identity in African communities. You say a law is set up to actually erase this, even though, as you and I know, in practice, Islam lived on even within black Christianity, but certainly whiteness, intervened, in that way. And, Professor Saito, when you talk about the, particular demonization of somebody who's a black radical and an imam, the struggle to not just claim what Dr. King called an equal right to do wrong, to just not want to have those things. Part of that is shrouded by the fact that we think we're demanding a right to speak or a right to organize politically, but actually we have to be demanding a property right, and that has implications, that carry with it. And, of course, Howie, as well, and if we think that abolishing whiteness, as our friend old Ignacio, would like us to imagine that we can do, is not possible, then that means all of the good political work you're talking about is being done by people who have a different property right than the people who are side by side, with them. And so I wonder if you just talk about the implications of the special status of property within law and how it can affect, how it affects the things that each of you were talking about.
Yeah,
And here, in Indigenous case, there's also property at stake in the everyday understanding of it, in terms of gaming revenues and things like that.
right, so, getting back to my slide on all the things you use once you're disenrolled, it's a concrete thing, to say that, I mean, once you get your paper, basically you're exiled from the land, which like, New York Times hasn't been taking photos, or folks have, like said, okay, like they're forced to leave. And so it's a huge ball of like everything is like a battery ram in a sense. And so there is no, this discussion is 40 hours times 1,000, like on the ability of not only like sovereignty, self-determination, self-identity, awareness, and I'm not even sure on the anthropological sense of like the ability for a group to say to another group, like, you're not members anymore. It's huge.
But sovereignty provides, a counter to some of the status of law within the U.S. constitutional system. And there's some kinds of property that aren't recognized because of treaties and because of sovereignty.
Right. So yeah, there's those state contract treaties that were better. At one point in the case law, states weren't allowed, and they were allowed, and then now. This discussion that I'm talking about is like I'm skipping over huge cases, but it's painful. Yeah, it's incredibly painful.
I'd like to add to that I think it's a sovereignty as the federal government respects it with respect to American Indian nations, I don't think is actually sovereignty. As far as I'm concerned, remember Bush, when he was asked what sovereignty means, it's something we give you, and that's, but it was a completely accurate summary of federal Indian law, right? So, real sovereignty would have those implications, when the Department of Interior has to put a stamp of approval on the Constitution, on the membership requirements, on the whatever that Indian nations are coming up with. I feel like it's a whole different story. Which kind of gets me to, I think that, I don't really see it in terms of the rest of us claiming and asserting property rights so much as, in certain respects, of course we are, but it seems to me like whiteness as property, when we're talking about the commodification of whiteness and, the property interest in whiteness, and the abolition of whiteness or not, it seems like there's two different things at work here, because there's been constructed whiteness identity as property, right? And there's a property interest, there's a right to exclude. It's very different from the racial ethnic identities of the rest of us, right? We don't have those same kinds of right to even decide who we are sometimes. We don't have the same kinds of right to exclude. And to me, that makes whiteness distinct from, what we think of as white folks and their national origins. Right? That's sort of one way to interpret it, but it has this whole overlay. So that's, to me, the issue. It's abolishing that's an issue, not whiteness in the sense of,
every so-called victory we have offers partial inclusion with the proviso that we police the boundaries of future inclusion against others. So more rights as citizens might strengthen the citizen-alien distinction At the same time, you're the recipient of inclusion. You're not given the total right to exclude, but you're actually ordered to exclude. You know, you can be in the military. You can get married. You know, you can have certain kinds of rights that depend on other people's lesser citizenship.
The key, or one, you know, this critical nexus of the Dawes Act and the Enrollment Act was the forced imposition of race, of the particular bloodline race, as being the definitive characteristic. You know? And it's that same frozen in time bloodlines, right? The whole one drop of blood is based upon, there was a moment in history when bloodlines were pure. There were pure whites and pure blacks, and everything flows from there. Well, so that's in effect what the federal statutory enrollment moment becomes, right? And then the use of bloodline as being an acceptable form of enrollment and disenrollment into tribes. So it is an imposed, not, you know, partial sovereignty. So there's partial sovereignties, but there's these moments imposed. But it is constantly back and forth. The understandings of race as derived from black-white race. This is the paradigmatic structure of how we understand these things are. It is the black-white formulations of racialization, pure whiteness, and pure blood that then infuses outward all the rest of these other kinds of considerations for Americans.
Look, as you know, blacks are punished for having any blackness, whereas Indians are punished for not having enough Indianness.
Which goes with what the purpose of those categories are.
Right.
Early imperative of performative identity, right? Especially with regards to the different kinds of trust, you know, property relations that were conferred, you know, based on the blood quantum, right? So there was a hierarchical, right? Based on who's perceived to be more assimilable and who would perform in a way, you know, not to mention overlaid with the kind of interspersed with white checkerboarding, you know, that was brought about by the Dawes Act, the actual interruption of large masses of Indian-held land. So it's, yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
Okay. You know, issues of assimilability, I think, are also linked to religion and how religion is racialized, right? The conflation of race and religion and so forth. And also how, you know, religion also functions in some respects as property, but also a bridge toward property. So, you know, with the case of enslaved Africans, for instance, their denial of the ability to practice religion was an exercise of rejecting a very sacred form of property, but during the latter stages of slavery, introducing them to Christianity, you see Christianity functioning as a proxy or a bridge or a means towards citizenship. And you see that again with the immigrants during the prerequisite cases, depending on the race of the individual. So Christianity can't function as a proxy for whiteness for individuals from the Levant because of phenotype, but it can function as a proxy for whiteness from individuals from East Asia and so forth. So what's frustrating about property, the way it's defined in legal terms, is that, you know, it's so narrow. It's either a parcel, it's either chattel, and its most liberal definitions, it can be intellectual property. But I think what's fascinating about Cheryl's work is that, you know, it provides the lexicon and the methodology to think about property in more broad terms and more existential terms as well.
Yeah.
Are we just going to open it up? Is that okay?
Yeah. Did everybody respond to George's initial
Yeah.
prompt?
I think that was
No, let's, I think
No,
Neil
go ahead. I'll take it.
I think what's really interesting in our discussion now is how immediately and importantly we focus on the instabilities of these supposedly rigid and stable structures that we call racial, biological, in the blood quantum sense, religious, and so on. And in some sense, Cheryl's work is like an archaeology of race in that way. It's like and lots of other CLT work shares that. Devin and Rachel's race law stories talked about how the law is constantly being forced to reinterpret race in order to defend privilege or defend hierarchy, racial hierarchy, as struggles happen. And, I think that is in some sense both a pitfall and a tremendous opportunity for us. I mean, what you're saying, George, what that echoes to me is the idea that when we win something, we also lose something. You win your demands through, say, civil rights legislation, and you transfer the power that that movements had. The movement is saying, hey, stop enforcing segregation. Undo segregation. And the movement is challenging segregation by Little Rock or whatever it is. And instead of that, the state takes that over and becomes the force that's at least in theory, supposed to do what the movement was previously doing. The movement accepts in some sense. Winning is losing this way because the state can then hegemonize the thing. Okay, so in all these ways, I think what we're doing is undermining our conception of the structure of racism, and that's what our work is. And as we continue to do that, I think it's going to be interesting to see how even such a magisterial thing as whiteness and property is going to look like that was bounded in a certain time and place and a certain archaeology. I mean, there's this. I stop with this, but there's this work by Lisa Gollibach. Do people know that work? The Lost Opportunity of Civil Rights or something like that is her title. She says that civil rights movement's decision, led by Thurgood Marshall, to focus on the 14th Amendment and on due process was a choice. And the other choice would have been to focus on the 13th Amendment, which was much more labor-oriented, coerced and voluntary slavery. And that was also going on. What would have happened if, of course you don't know, but that would be a whole legacy would be different. The whole ideology would be different if labor and labor rights, I'm not arguing for this, by the way, I'm just pointing it out, had been the focus instead of due process.
I can't resume the continuity. There was a thread that so I'll just say it. So in order to be able to talk about this, it's like the frustration. I was just here. I use first names because it's easier for me.
Okay.
How do you sort through all this stuff? And again, part of the power of Cheryl's piece is she picks out she uses race as we were understanding and developing a conceptualization. And then, as you said, picks out a particular moment for this archaeology. And she uses the full terrain of whiteness. Of property theory. That's why Peggy Radin's work is so influential. It's because Peggy had done the heavy lifting on the property theory side. So that there was this whole taxonomy, there's this whole this whole layout of the different elements of property. So the point about property is it's not just a thing. It's not just a piece of property. It's not just an expectation. It's a whole family of a sense of overlapping, contradictory areas. And so in that, then Cheryl goes through. If you look at that, I was looking at the table of contents. And that's why Peggy loves it so much. This master theoretician of property goes through it. Oh, Cheryl really understood what I had done in property, because she did every bit of it. She went through all these variations, and then represented the mastery and reintroduction of the racial side, right, of the emerging understanding of that. And so, but so she uses race and property theory as the sorting mechanism. And it sounds like you haven't found your sorting mechanism yet, because there is this terrain of sovereignty, as we're all grappling now with what it means of sovereignty. It's a terrain. It's like these bodies of all. One of the things I was trying to play with when I was doing this, so like whiteness, property, whiteness is another theory, or the other. So I ended up doing just multiple whitenesses and property rather than flipping the right side, but I was looking, this is the whiteness as blank, power structures as a body of law. And the one I came up with, and I realized was way out of my league, was whiteness as the rule of law. Right? This broad area, the rule of law, or this whole messy terrain of all these things that are invoked in terms of human rights, international sovereignty. It goes all over the place, right? It gets thrown out and deployed as a weapon in the same way that property is used as a weapon. And there may be a way to try and do it, but it requires the heavy lifting on both sides. The theorized, if you're going to work in the legal sphere, right, this theorization of one particular body, and you can draw upon someone else who has done work. Because the other one I was going to use was possibly whiteness as citizenship.
No.
Because what?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because citizenship has been theorized. There was this, and Hiroshi has done all kinds of this. Hiroshi and Letty, they're all speaking here, and Rose.
So will the indigenous claims be seen as?
But see, you need a sorting mechanism. That's the point. In other words, it is for, and what
Well,
is
I think the rule of law is better, or modernity
No.
or something. but-
My purpose was in the Asian, I was doing an Asian American.
Oh,
drill.
okay, fair
Right?
enough. Sorry, I
So
thought.
so in order to sort through
Yeah.
whiteness for Asian Americans as blank, in other words, I wasn't doing sovereignty, I wasn't doing indigenous peoples, I was doing
Okay.
Asian
Got
Americans.
it.
And for Asian Americans,
Sorry.
right, no, that's right, what's your purpose? How are you going to sort this through? So, the rule, that was, so two things, identity. What is Muslim identity? And the downside is, it's borrowing the wrong side, it seems to me, of the master's tools, which is a scriptive identification of a faux religious category. This is Mohammedanism was the reinvention for late 19th, early 20th century imperial purposes, to invent a religion so that they can declare it as equal, so that they can proceed to then, manipulate it to their fashion. In Mohammedanism, the very fact they borrowed the term from Christianity and reimposed it, and it was only when it's hopelessly outdated that they finally had to change it to something else, without any regard for what the real character of Islam was. But that's why, and they use that. So the danger of using Muslim identity is this inchoate, completely inchoate social grouping of those of Islamic, Muslim and Islamic faith, which is scattered, as your own work demonstrates, over socially in the U.S. history, of this incredible terrain of people, places, races, historical moments and things that are like, I can't even imagine what that would mean. But you throw out the term, and you seem to feel like, is it something that it's being done to us or us to them? And I'm not so sure the collective side of Muslim identity in America is something, I don't know, you guys have talked about it more, but I don't get any feel from your presentation that you grapple with it adequately. And my challenge to you, Holly, on this terrain, I was making a list, and this is my religion, hanging out with the religion people. The last comment, right? You talked about, you used words like, where is my, expiation, curse of whiteness, redemption of whites, the souls of white folks.
And religious side,
They're all Christian. No, they're not just religious. They're Christian.
This is Yom Kippur today. I'm violating my religion just by talking to you.
We're all grateful, Howard.
And so the challenge, right, in the challenge of the use of religion in this questions of power and subordination are the very language that we use, this exclusionary and subordinated. Because, and this is where I get to put on my ethnic Buddhist hat, which is, I claim Buddhism, which is primarily a non-redemptionist religion. I mean, this is, there is no savior. Like everything else, right? Whatever we lump together as Buddhism is many traditions, but so one of the strong themes is there is no savior and it isn't a redemption as such by someone else. And so when you use those terminologies, you're beating me up and I resent it. But I just, it's just, anyway.
Okay. the question I have for you is, instead of saying how should whiteness be approached politically, what about how do we live in Indigenous sovereignty? That's the starting question. And I ask that because we assume certain things about law. And the question as an Indigenous scholar is, where does this law come from? How does it come into being? And when it comes into being, what is it that it actually replaces? And what is the relationship? Like, is there really, like, okay, let me rephrase it. If I talk, okay, I'll talk about sovereignty in Australia, Indigenous sovereignty. My sovereignty is grounded through a bloodline to country, but not in the same terminology of blood quantum. So it's through ancestry, it's through descent, and it's through created beings, right? So they've made Kondamuka, the place where I come from. And I cannot be anything other than a Kondamuka. I can't be a Walpri, I can't be a Yolngu, I'm a Kondamuka. And all of my relatives, which is everything in that country, is connected to me, yes. But white man comes with his law and imposes. But that sovereignty still prevails. And what happens is white man's law sits on top. And so the question for me is, what is it like? What if we start to think about what is it like to live in Indigenous sovereignty? And do we move from that out? Because I think when we seek to talk about how should whiteness be approached politically, we're still asking the question within the episteme. And I want to get outside of it, yeah. Because the problem is, to save the planet, we need to get outside the episteme. We need to stop being possessive subjects. We need to actually stop acting through the logic of capital. There are things that we need to change about being human, the way that it is constructed through whiteness, yes? So we have to get outside the episteme for the question. So what is it like to live in Indigenous sovereignty should be the starting point, because this is the beginning of America, same as that was the beginning of Australia in the sense of those nation states. So that's my question. Sorry. Everybody's saying it,
No.
Now we're waiting for the answer.
Well, it is, but it's a different way of talking, in terms of anti-racism.
No, absolutely.
There's a whole, it creates a different shift.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely. No, I totally appreciate what you're saying.
I also really appreciate what you're saying, but now I'm wondering, putting your conversations together, how these questions still live within your reframing?
I think that my reframing, the questions as they are, have to be within the context.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But for me, knowing a different way to be human, because I was raised different, like I kind of like spent last night talking to Daniel, that like when you're raised with a different way of being, but you have to become something else, right? The kind of epistemological challenges that you are confronted with on a day-to-day as you grow is mind-blowing, you know. But what it does do, it's always guided me in terms of that's my anchor. Like when I want to kill theory, you know, I'm pretty good at it. Is not because you know I'm totally you know, scholared in it. I don't want to use that word. It's basically because I can see through it, because there is this other way to be that's different. Yeah. And I think that, you know, whilst ever we continue down the road that we are going as humans, we will destroy ourselves. There is nothing. as far as I'm concerned, that's more certain. So we have to construct a different way to be human. We have to think beyond the things that contain us. And the law is fundamentally one of the worst things. Like the law, it's everything in one sense. It controls everything. And we are never outside of it. When are we ever outside of it? Really? We all are in relation to it all the time. The desks we sit at, the mere fact that I can say that I'm a citizen, the mere fact that I'm a university professor, I mean, all of those things. But I think that, for me I've gotten as far as trying to think beyond. My work is trying to get, unravel the idea of the possessive subject. It's trying to say we have to stop being possessive. That's the starting point. We have to learn to give up. We have to learn to share. We have to understand that there are limits to this planet. And part of you have to, I mean, it sounds crazy, but we have to learn to stop being such possessive subjects. We have to learn to live with less. We have to stop being extractive. And how do we get out of the logic of capital? How do we undo that?
Yep. Sorry. No. I really appreciate that comment because, and for me, it does, the question Howard framed for us, and the questions we've all been raising, fit within what Elin is saying really well to me. Because what we're talking about is different understandings of sort of what are parallel universes in a sense, right? And it's like within U.S. discourse generally, right? As people of color, we are very conscious of the fact that we live, there are these, Du Bois's dual, consciousness, etc., right? That we have one kind of consciousness, but then we have our own different one that's framed in terms of our understandings of identity and stuff. And we're critical of folks who only live in the white bubble, right? And can't get outside of that. And I think what you're doing is adding another much more, a deeper version of that, a bigger one. You're saying not only do we need to step out of the bubble of whiteness as constructed in our own societies, but to this larger understanding of being a human being, which we all, we may not be indigenous to this particular land, but we are all human beings related to the land and the planet, and we're all gonna, not have the oxygen to breathe or whatever. And that allows us, to get some perspective on all of the stuff that we're talking about. So to me, it makes the question even more important, right? How do we function as whatever,
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Can I just make a couple real very quick points? Because actually, I would rather continue this conversation.
The schedule is like,
I don't really want to leave.
I'm gonna sit down, but
Before I forget, I wonder, and I'm sorry I missed the first talk done. The Khaled, before I forget, from what I gleaned from the description of what you're talking about, I wonder whether some of the employment discrimination cases would be helpful, because you're talking about the conflation of Arab identity and Muslim identity, but the Hazen paper v. Biggins age versus, pension, that the court found that those were analytically distinct, and then the American Airlines and Rogers with regards to grouping and dress codes, status conduct. Anyway, that was just a thought in terms of a hook or reasonable factors other than age. So that's just a sort of legal hook, in terms of thinking about it. But I'm wondering, because I totally get what you're both talking about, and I really like the point that Howie raised about the 13th Amendment, at least the Gullah piece, but I think it still goes back to the framework of citizenship, right? So then it's like, is that, like critical race theory kind of grows up within theorizing freedom within the 20th century, right? But it's still within the paradigm of the rule of law and the Constitution emphasizing the 14th Amendment. right? So we're still making this turn into the 21st century to think about the distinction between land dispossession and labor exploitation and everything else that falls into the category of citizenship, right? So what analytically and theoretically, and I'm, thinking about Elin's, comment, but are we looking at, I don't know if you like Arturo Escobar's imperial globality or global coloniality, in terms of that framing as a starting point, or are we back to, left formulations like Wallerstein and world systems theory? I mean, theoretically, I'm just curious how it is, what is it that you've...
Okay. At one level, we know that this is all about power. Yes, irrespective of, to kind of talk about what you're saying and shifting it into citizenship to me is really quite reductive. I think that for me, it's about power relations. And within the academy, we've done a great deal, that since the Enlightenment and the emergence of disciplines, of theorising about power. We have different theories of power. We have Marx's idea of power. We have Foucault's idea of power. We have different kinds of theories of power. But we don't necessarily have any theories about how to give it up. We don't, right? We just have theories about what it is. We don't have theories about how do we give it up. And that's the starting point. If the problem is about power relations, then we have to actually work out how to give up power rather than how to exercise it. We spend a lot of our life, humans exercise power relations, right? Whether it's Wallerstein's theory, that stuff to me all just fits within a particular bin, right? And I think that, again, it just gives us an idea of how he thinks power works. It's how Foucault thinks power works. It's how Marx thinks power works. But what is it like to theorise how to give it up? Where do we start with giving it up? What's the theory of actually renouncing power? I'm not being sarcastic. I'm trying to.
Right.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that.
That's where I'm. Okay. Sorry.
Jen, were you thinking of the clock? Did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I
Sorry,
wanted to say something.
sorry.
Say something
We do
first.
have-
You get the last word.
We do have a break. We do have a break until 10:45.
Questions?
We do have a break.
Oh, the next session is 5.
Yeah.
The next one starts
Yeah.
at...
We all need to go to the bathroom and get a drink of water.
Yeah.
You get the last word, Jasmine.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just gonna say in connection to that, and then also connection to what Professor Winant was saying. What I was just thinking about is if we're trying to reach beyond our power and our privilege, how sometimes in the process of doing so, we evade our own complicity, our own, the ways in which we're trying to kind of position ourselves outside of that privilege. And so it kind of reminded me of this piece I read last year called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Professor Kaylin Yang, who happened to be my professor when I went to UC San Diego. And a lot of their piece is just about how, for instance, what you were saying about us, people of color and the movement needing white allies, and how, what did you say, racism hurts whites, how that can complicate our move towards, reaching beyond our own power and our privilege, because some folks might be making those moves in order to disavow their privilege without at first recognizing that they have it, and recognizing that even in their moves and their processes towards reaching beyond that, they can reaffirm their power and their privilege in that process. So I guess that's all I was saying.
Thanks.
Good place to end.
Thanks very much.